In this video, I'll be talking about PractiTest test management platform integration with Selenium C# code. In order to achieve the integration, we are going to perform the automated workflow creation via the REST API provided by the PractiTest platform. The first and foremost thing in order to make the integration is to get the authentication token from PractiTest. And once we have the authentication token, we can then get its relative project ID and the author ID to start performing the rest of the operation, like creating the test from the API, creating the test set from API, and associating test and test set from the API to create an test instance, and then execute the automated test against the test instance in order to create the test run. And once we have the test run, we can then see the complete execution in the PractiTest dashboard. And that's how the whole workflow happens. As you can see, this whole integration is going to be so seamless that we are going to be just using the REST API provided by the PractiTest platform to achieve this operation. So let's see what I really mean about the PractiTest APIs. As you can see, if you go to the practitest.com/API v2, you can see that we have a complete detail of how the PractiTest API v2 is going to be looking like. So this is the version 2 of the REST API, which provides all the rich set of APIs that we can use to create the test step, test sets, instances, runs, and the test runs and the test steps, everything using PractiTest APIs. And as you can see, in order to create the test, all we need to do is just call the API and pass the authentication token to perform the operation of creating the test. We can also get all the test details from our project, create a test, show a specific test, and also update a specific test and delete the specific test. And the same goes for all the rest of the operation, like creating a test set, instances, and the runs as well. And these are the APIs that we are going to be using for the integration with Selenium C# code, and we'll see how we can achieve it. As I told before, in order to use these APIs, we need to have the authentication token, project ID, and the author ID. In order to obtain all these details, we can go just to the PractiTest platform, and you can see there is something called as the API tokens within our account settings of the PractiTest. In order to get the details about the project settings, just go to any of the project, which you can do from the personal settings, and then choose the project that you are interested in, and you will get the project ID from here. So that's it. These are the prerequisites that we need in order to get started with the APIs to integrate within our Selenium C# code. But now let's first see the project that we are going to be working with in order to do the integration itself. This is a very super simple Selenium C# code. On the top, it is running a spec flow code, and as you can see that the spec flow code is super straightforward. This is the scenario that it is going to be doing. It's going to navigate into an application. It's going to click the login button. It's going to enter the username and password, and then it's going to verify if there is an employee details available on the page. That's it. And all the operation that you are seeing over here is implemented using the step definitions of the spec flow over here. And also it has the hooks, which is going to be responsible for initializing the Selenium web driver and tearing down the Selenium web driver. So we just have used two attributes like before scenario and after scenarios. So now let's try to run this code and see how it actually works. And as you can see that it has just opened the website, clicking the login and then entering the username and password and then performing the authentication operation. And the test has got passed. But now that we don't really have any integration with the PractiTest itself. And as we go to the PractiTest test management platform over here, and if we go to our test set and runs, and as well as the test library, we don't really see any of the data or the execution details like tests, as well as the test set and test run happened over here. Now the quest is to integrate Selenium C# code along with the PractiTest test management platform itself. And as I told you before, we are going to be using the powerful rich set of APIs provided by the PractiTest in order to do the integration. But in order to achieve that, we are going to be using an HTTP client provided by the .NET C# world to perform the get, post, and patch operation. Well, as that said, the first thing we're going to do here is we are going to create a new package. I'm going to call this as PractiTest util. And this folder is going to contain some of the classes, and I'm going to call this as PractiTest, and I'm going to create a constructor over here. And as I told you, we are going to be using the HTTP client to perform the operation here. So I'm going to create a private read-only HTTP client, and we're going to create a new instance of the HTTP client over here, and then we're going to set the base address of the HTTP client as the PractiTest's API base URL. And now that you may be asking, what is the base URL of the PractiTest APIs? There are two data centers that the PractiTest offers to the client. One is the US data center, another one is the EU data center. So I'm actually using the EU or the European Union data center, and that's the one which I'm going to be using for this particular demonstration. But if you are using the US version, then you should be using the US URL, which is nothing but the api.practitest.com. And this is the URL that I'm going to be using for my EU data center. So once we have this particular base URL, we can then start perform the rest of the operation that we are going to be looking for. The first thing which we're going to do is to create the new test in the PractiTest itself. In order to create the new test in the PractiTest, we need to write a method which can perform these operations. And the code is going to look something like this. And as you can see, this method is going to take two parameters here. One is the test name and the priority of your test. We can keep extending this particular code with multiple different parameters, but for now, for the simplicity purpose, we only have the test name and the priority, and the data that we are going to be passing in as a body of the API is going to look something like this. And as you can see, we have hard-coded the author ID over here, and then we have passed the test name and the priority, which is being passed as a parameter into the data string itself. And the rest of the code is quite straightforward. All we're going to do is we are just going to be creating an HTTP content of the data, within serializing it, and then we are passing it to create test API endpoint, which is nothing but this one, and we are passing in the API token. And this is my personal API token, and this is going to change for you as well as the project ID and the author ID. And once we pass in all the details, we are then going to be pushing this to the HTTP client. We're going to parse the result, and then we're going to return the ID of the test itself. So this is a super simple method to create a new test in PractiTest platform using the API. And this is exactly the same thing we are going to be doing to create a test set as well. But before we create the test set, we're also going to do additional operation, which is nothing but checking if the test already exists in our PractiTest platform. And that's going to be very, very handy while we are going to write a wrapper method within the same class file. Just bear with me, we are going to be doing that pretty quickly. But for now, this method, the isTestExist method, is going to verify if the test that we are creating over here already exists within the PractiTest platform. And the most important thing to note here in the API is we are using the name_exact parameter to verify if the test name that we are passing in already exists or not. That is the only change to the code, but the rest of the operation is going to be quite similar to how we have used within the creating the new test. I'm going to add the missing references here, and that's about the method creation of isTestExist. And the same thing we are going to be doing for creating a new test set and verifying if the test set already exists, and the method is going to look something like this. And as you can see, it is going to accept the same test set, priority, and version over here, and then it's going to perform the post operation with the sets.json, and then it's going to accept the API token for us. And the exact same thing we are going to do over here in this method, the isTestSetExists method, where it is going to be verifying if the test set already exists within our PractiTest platform using the parameter name_exact. And once we have the test set and the test, we are then going to create a new test instance. But before we create a new test instance, we are going to take a different approach this time to create body of the test instance. Instead of just passing it something like a string data like this, we are going to actually create a model within our PractiTest code. And it's going to be pretty much like a personal preference, like how you want to maintain the code. But we are going to be doing that over here in order to just simplify how the code is going to look like. So I'm going to create a folder over here. I'm going to call this as model. And this particular model is going to hold two class files. One is the test instance model. Another one is the test run model. The test instance model code is going to look something like this. As you can see, this is just a representation of what the body of the test model really expects for us to insert within the API of the PractiTest platform. So let's add all the missing references, and the code looks something like this. And the same thing, we are going to be doing it for the test run model as well. And we're going to add the missing references. So we are going to be using this test run model later in the code. But for now, this is the most important thing that we will require to create the test instance. Let's go to the PractiTest once again, and start adding our actual code that we have been adding all these days, which is nothing but creating the new test instance and also verifying if the test instance already exists. And the method is going to look something like this. And as you can see, this time it is going to take a test instance dot model attribute, which is nothing but the one that we just created over here. And as you can see, this time it is going to take the attribute as parameter instead of taking like a string parameters. So it is taking an actual type, which is nothing but the attributes type, so that we can just pass in over here and then perform the rest of the operation. And the code is going to be pretty much exactly the same. The only change is here we're calling the instances.json instead of the sets as well as the tests that we used before. And the is test instance exist is going to be pretty much exactly the same code, except that it's going to verify if the instances already exist or not. And the next method that we are going to be working with is creating the test step for the test execution that we are actually going to be doing. And as you can see, this create test step method is the one which is responsible for injecting the test execution steps for the test that we are executing. And you will also notice that it accepts two parameters. One is the step data, another one is the instance ID. And this step data is going to be coming up for us pretty soon, and we will see how that really going to happens from the hooks.cs file. And also you will notice that there is going to be an instance ID as a parameter, which is responsible for you to tell for which test instance these steps and the test belongs to. And once we have these details, we then formulate the body pretty much like how we did in all these different methods before. And we are going to be injecting these data directly in the post operation along with the runs.json file as the API and the token that we have obtained from our profile. And that's about creating the test steps. And once we have all these details, we are going to create one of the most important method which is going to be useful for us to perform all these different operations. As we already know about the workflow of our PractiTest, in order to create a test run, we need to ensure that we create a new test and create a test set and create a test instance and then run the test against that particular test instance. And it is also super important to understand that if we are going to be targeting our test execution to the same test that we are executing, then we don't really have to necessarily recreate the same test or duplicating the same test again or creating the duplicate test set as well. In order to achieve all these operations, this method is going to make all our life much easier. The create PractiTest session method, where it is going to accept the test name, test set name, priority, and the version for us, and then it is going to perform all the different checks that we have written earlier. The is test exist, is test set exist, is test instance exist, and all these IDs are going to be then used to ensure that we don't really create the duplicate test set and the instances every time while we create or every time we'll perform the execution itself. So that's about the whole create PractiTest session code. So once we have all these methods for the PractiTest, we are then going to start using these methods within our spec flows test hooks.cs file. Now that we actually need to inject test name, set name, priority, and the set version itself within our code. In order to achieve all these operations in a more streamlined fashion, we are actually going to create a simple class file, which is going to look something like this. It is called as the PractiTest details class file. It has the test name, set name, priority, and the set versions, which you can actually even insert these data from a configuration file within the Selenium C# code. But for the simplicity purpose, we are actually going to be hard coding those values right into the before test attributes of our spec flow code, something like this. And as you can see here, we are just injecting the test name as the EA UI test, testing 3.6 UI feature, highest, and the test set versions. And this PractiTest details is showing the red color. We are going to be injecting in over here as the declarations. And then it also requires the test run model. So we're going to inject the references over here. So now that's about the before test attribute. Once we have all the initialization data, we then need to also initialize our PractiTest itself. In order to initialize the PractiTest with all these details like test name, set names, priority, and the set versions, we are going to be creating another attribute, something like this, before feature attributes. Over here, we are going to call our PractiTest class that we have created. And then we are going to call the create PractiTest session method that we just created, which is this one. And as you can see, it's going to accept the name, set name, priority, and version. And that's exactly been passed over here that we have initialized before during the execution. And as we know in the spec flow, every time it's going to encounter these attributes, it is going to execute them in a specific order, like before the test execution, before the feature file. These data are going to be streamlined for us and passed through all these different methods automatically. And now that we have initialized our stubs as well, as you can see over here, and this is going to be something which is going to be used within our another attribute, which is going to be this one, the insert test run steps attribute. Over here, we are telling that if there is going to be no error, then inject the past result within our execution. And if there is going to be any error, then inject the fail status within our execution. So this way we tell that we actually see two different kind of execution result within our PractiTest dashboard. And the last operation that we need to do is to actually create the test step itself, because all this time we have just created the connectivity with the PractiTest. We have created these steps over here, but we have not really injected these steps into our create steps method that we created before, which is going to be this particular method. But in order to do that, as you can see, the parameter actually requires an instance ID as well. And this instance ID is the one which is responsible for us to tell that this is the instance ID that we need to be associating our test run itself. So how do we actually get that particular test instance ID? We are actually going to create one more method here. I'm going to call this as get test instance ID, which is going to take the test name as the parameter. And as you can see, it is going to go and verify the instances. It's going to use the name underscore exact, and it's going to give us the instance ID for that automatically. And that's the method that we really require for us to be passed within our create test steps method. So let's see how we could able to do that using the attribute in the spec flow over here. So we are going to create an attribute called as an after step attribute. We're going to call the instance ID, which is nothing but the method that we just created, the get instance ID. We're going to pass the test name, and then it is going to give us the instance ID which is responsible for the execution. And we're going to pass the test instance ID as a parameter to the create test steps method. And that's about the integration part that we are talking about in the PractiTest platform. So now that we have wired up all the API methods which are responsible for creating the test stubs, instances, and the test run itself. And now that if we try executing this, there should be an integration happening with the PractiTest platform. So let's try to run this code and see what is really going to happen. So as you can see, this time the test has got passed pretty much exact like how it happened before. But now if we go to our PractiTest platform over here, you will see that we actually have a test execution really happen for us as well. And now you can see that we have our test like EAUI test, and then it also has a test set and run, which has the version of 3.6. And if we just go over here, you will see that it has a green color pie chart over here, which means all the test has got passed. And if we hit the views, you will see that there is a test run being executed, which is going to be this one. And it holds all the different details or the steps that it has used. Like I navigate to application, I click the login, I log in with the following details, and I should see the employee details. So it has all the details that we have really injected from our test execution over here. And all these things are really happening because we have specified them in the test hooks within our after steps over here. Well, now that we have seen an integration with the PractiTest and it is working fine as expected, what if our test actually fails and how PractiTest really behaves during that particular point of time? So let's see a failure test execution. I have removed an S from the steps over here so that the test will actually fail, because it is going to verify if the employee details really exist. But if it is like employee detail, then the test is eventually going to fail. As you can see that the test has got failed and the Selenium is complaining that the employee detail link is missing. So now that if we just go back to our PractiTest and if we hit the test set and run, you can see that it has not really recreated a new test set for us, or it has not also created a new test for us in the test library. And as you can see, it has used the same test name, same test set and a run, except that the test has really got failed over here. And if we just go to the view, you will see that there is a latest run which has just got failed. And that's because our test really has got over here as failure, and that's the reason PractiTest is reporting us that failure. And now that we have seen the executions and the integrations are happening seamlessly for us. But let's take another scenario which is going to be very, very practical, where we are just going to modify the test set name to version 3.5 and the set version as 3.5. So doing this way, we are telling essentially that we are going to be using the same test, which is the EA UI test, but this time we are going to be testing our application against a different version, which is nothing but a slightly older version of the application. So we wanted to see what happens if the executions is happening and how the test actually behaves. I'm going to change back the working version of the scenario over here by adding an S, and then we're going to run the test. And you will see that the test has got passed. And if we go to the PractiTest this time, and if we go to the test library, you will still see that we have the same test, which is nothing but the EA UI test, but on the test set and run, we have a different version this time, which is the testing 3.5 UI feature. And once we go into that, we also have the test instance and the test along with the steps over here, which is great. Now that we could see that if we wanted to test our same application with different versions, we could able to verify them as well using PractiTest much easily. And that's exactly bring us to the point about the powerful PractiTest dashboard. PractiTest dashboard are one of the most important and amazing feature of PractiTest, where it is going to show us a lot more detail about how the executions are really happening in real time as well. If we just see on the left hand side of our test set, we can see there is a auto filter by versions. This is automatically filtered based on the version that we have in our test execution. And as you can see, we have version 3.6. If I hit that, it's going to just show us the version 3.6 of the test set. And same thing is going to happen for version 3.5 as well. And the same details we can actually leverage even further with the power of the dashboard if we just go to the info center and to the dashboard. I'm going to hit this dashboards, and then I'm going to create a new dashboard, and I'm going to call this as release 3.5, and I'm going to save this dashboard, and then I'm going to add the items to the dashboard. And over here, I'm going to choose the entity as run, and item type going to be the pie chart, and I'm going to hit continue over here. And then I'm going to choose the test set level filter with version 3.5. As you can see, this is going to be the one which is coming automatically using the auto filter by version. So I'm going to choose that, and then I'm going to save the dashboard items. And the same thing I'm going to be doing by adding one more item, where I'm going to be choosing the same run, and this time we are going to be using the execution progress, and I'm going to hit continue, and I'm going to choose the version as 3.5 and hit the save dashboard item. So this way now I have two items in our dashboard. And if I go back to my dashboard this time to this info center dashboard, and if I go to the release 3.5, you will see that it is going to show me a real-time dashboard of version 3.5 along with the pie chart as well as run execution progress. If we wanted to see what's really happening during our execution, we can just go to our test. And let's say if we wanted to make this test as failure, we'll run the test. And the test has got failed. And if we go back to our PractiTest, and if we hit this update dashboard now link, you will see that it is going to show us the progress of what's really happening to our execution. There is a failure test, and that's why the pie charts is showing us the failure and one pass result. And the same is going to be true for the run execution progress as well. So this way, there is one place where we can, or as a manager can see what's really happening with the execution of our test run. And since we have version 3.6 as well, we can do the exact same thing. We can create a release 3.6, and we can start adding the item to the dashboard pretty much like how we did before. And now if we go to the dashboard over here, and you can see that we have release for version 3.5 as well as for release 3.6. and you will see that it is going to show us the details pretty much robust this time. And because in version 3.6 we also did a passing as well as a failing test execution, that's why you see pretty much exactly for the release 3.5 and release 3.6 we have the same result. But yeah, it is actually executing and showing us the real-time execution history of what's really happening within our test for each and every release while the automated test execution is happening. And that's the power of the Selenium C# integration with PractiTest and the powerful PractiTest dashboard.